December 21st, 1944. The Ardennes forest lies frozen under a sheet of white silence. The air is heavy with the distant echo of artillery, dull, rhythmic, endless. Along a narrow valley near St. Vith, a blackened railway cuts through the snow like a scar across the land, where trains once thundered with fuel, ammunition, and food for the advancing Allied armies. Only twisted rails now remain, bent like ribbons, shattered by German bombs. Freight cars lie on their sides, wheels half buried in snow. Steam hisses from ruptured pipes, mingling with smoke from the burned-out wreckage. To the men of the 701st Railway Grand Division, this isn't just a rail line. It's a lifeline, the artery that feeds Patton's tanks, Eisenhower's plans, and the hope of the entire Western Front. They stand in silence, their breath fogging in the bitter air, knowing one truth. Without this line, the Allied counteroffensive will starve before it even begins. And so, as snow thickens and shells thunder in the distance, a handful of American railroad engineers begin a race against time to rebuild an entire supply line, not in weeks, but in 48 hours. The winter of 1944 was supposed to mark the Allies' final push into Germany. By mid-December, the Western Front stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland, held together by a vast machine of men, fuel, and steel. Supply trains rolled day and night, carrying everything from rations and medical gear to artillery shells and tank parts. But the machine was fragile. Every bullet, every blanket, depended on the unbroken rhythm of logistics. In the heart of that system ran the railroads, rebuilt by the U.S. Army Transportation Corps from the wreckage of occupied Europe. They called them the steel arteries of victory. And when those arteries were cut, entire armies could bleed to death. On December 16, 1944, the German army struck back with unexpected fury. More than 200,000 troops and 1,000 tanks surged through the snow-covered Ardennes in a desperate counteroffensive. The Allies were caught unprepared. Dense forests hid the panzers. Thick fog grounded Allied aircraft. Convoys stalled. Fuel dumps burned. The map that once showed a steady Allied advance now showed a bulge, a wound in the center of the line. Amid that chaos, one of the first targets the Germans hit was the railway network behind the front. Bridges were blown, tracks torn apart by artillery, locomotives abandoned in frozen cuts. The intention was clear: isolate the forward divisions, choke the supply flow, and paralyze the Allied counterattack before it began. Near St. Vith, a vital rail junction, one of these supply arteries lay in ruins. A section of track stretching across a narrow valley had been bombed, sabotaged, and blocked by derailed freight cars. It wasn't just damage, it was annihilation. The Third Army's lifeline had been severed. For days, supply trains were diverted hundreds of miles off course. Trucks tried to fill the gap, but icy roads and constant Luftwaffe raids made the task impossible. Fuel reserves dropped dangerously low. Tank crews began rationing movement. Commanders realized that without this single stretch of rail restored, the momentum of the entire Allied campaign could falter. At that moment, the call went out to the 701st Railway Grand Division, an unheralded group of American engineers, mechanics, and civilian railroad men wearing Army uniforms. They weren't frontline fighters, yet their job was every bit as vital. Their orders were brief and impossible. Reopen the line within 48 hours. No exceptions. When the message reached their command post, snow was falling thick and fast. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Enemy artillery still harassed the region. But for these men, many former workers from Pennsylvania, Illinois, and the Great Northern Lines, rebuilding railroads wasn't new. They had laid track through jungles, deserts, and bomb-scarred villages across Europe. What made this task different was the clock. As the 701st rolled toward the ruins, they passed columns of refugees trudging through snowdrifts. the burned shells of American half-tracks, and supply trucks wrecked by shell fire. The horizon flashed with distant bombardment. Somewhere out there, Patton's armored divisions were preparing to counterattack, and they would need every gallon of fuel this rail line could deliver. When the crew arrived, they found devastation that defied imagination. Rails twisted like pretzels, sleepers shattered, ballast blasted into muddy craters. A bridge over a small stream had collapsed entirely, its iron trusses jutting upward like broken ribs. Yet among the ruins stood a single water tower, scorched but upright, a lonely marker of what once was order amid chaos. Their commanding officer, Captain William M. Harris, climbed onto a pile of wreckage and surveyed the destruction. According to later reports, he said only one thing: "We start now." Within hours, lanterns flickered through the snow. Bulldozers roared to life. Men swung sledgehammers in near darkness. A portable field kitchen brewed coffee beside piles of broken rail. To the 701st, this wasn't just construction, it was resurrection. And as the night deepened, word spread among nearby infantry that the railroad boys were trying to bring the line back. Soldiers trudging to the front would pause to watch sparks fly from cutting torches, as if witnessing a quiet miracle in the frozen dark. Behind every victory in World War II stood an invisible army, not of soldiers, but of mechanics, railwaymen, and logisticians who understood that wars are won as much by movement as by firepower. By late 1944, the U.S. Army's supply network stretched back hundreds of miles from the front, through France, into ports like Cherbourg, Le Havre, and Antwerp. Trains moved ceaselessly along this system, carrying ammunition, gasoline, and food to the depots that fed Patton's Third Army. When the Germans launched their Ardennes offensive, they aimed not just to break the front line, but to sever that supply web. Hitler's generals believed that if they could choke the Allies' logistics, if Patton's tanks stalled for lack of fuel, the offensive could drive to Antwerp and split the Western armies. In those first days of December, they nearly succeeded. Fuel became the Allies' lifeblood. Every armored thrust consumed thousands of gallons per hour. Truck convoys known as the Red Ball Express, once the pride of Allied logistics, struggled through ice and fog. Road traffic choked. Depots ran dry. Commanders sent frantic messages up the chain. No fuel, no mobility. At the same time, weather grounded Allied aircraft, the one tool that usually shielded supply convoys from German attack. For the first time since Normandy, the Allies found themselves fighting blind and cold. In this frozen paralysis, the simplest infrastructure, a bridge, a rail spur, a culvert, became more valuable than divisions of men. General George S. Patton, then commanding the U.S. Third Army, grasped this instantly. His planned counterattack to relieve Bastogne depended entirely on keeping supplies moving. He demanded that engineers clear the lines, whatever the cost. And so, while artillery thundered at the front, rail units worked behind it, silent, tireless, unseen. The 741st renewed von 301st Railway Grand Division operated as part of the military railway service under the Transportation Corps. Most of its men were veterans of American freight lines, practical, men who had built bridges in blizzards and repaired tracks under fire before. They knew the science of steel expansion in the cold, the weight a bridge truss could bear, and the smell of overheated brakes when a locomotive strained on a gradient. Their task near St. Vith was suicidal on paper. The destroyed section crossed a narrow valley that had turned into a swamp of melted snow and shell holes. To rebuild it meant laying fresh ties and rails, hauling timber for a bridge, and doing it all while under intermittent artillery fire and Luftwaffe strafing. Yet they carried no rifles beyond sidearms. Their weapons were crowbars, wrenches, and acetylene torches. Army reports later noted that the engineers worked in continuous shifts, using borrowed infantry equipment to dig and reinforce embankments. Bulldozers cleared wreckage under tarpaulins to hide sparks from German observers. The crews improvised rail cranes out of truck chassis and pulleys, salvaging twisted rails and heating them to reshape on site. In freezing temperatures, that alone was a feat of endurance. As hours passed, their effort became more than a repair. It was a message. The Germans had calculated that Allied logistics would collapse under winter pressure. Instead, in less than a day, the Americans began proving them wrong. Fuel depots rerouted shipments by truck to the nearest intact station, where they would soon meet the resurrected line. Patton's headquarters, hearing of the progress, reportedly sent a single telegram: "Keep the line alive. We move when you do." That sentence carried more weight than any medal. It meant the counterattack, the turning of the entire battle, waited on a handful of men bent over frozen rails. Meanwhile, intelligence intercepts recorded German frustration. Commanders reported that destroyed infrastructure was being miraculously restored. They could not comprehend how, in such conditions, with snow, bombardment, and chaos, American forces were repairing faster than the Wehrmacht could destroy. The secret was organization. The Transportation Corps operated with industrial precision. Supply trains in staging yards hundreds of miles behind the line were already loaded with rails, tools, locomotives, even prefabricated bridge segments. Where Europe saw destruction, the Americans saw an assembly job waiting to begin. By the second night, sparks lit the valley like constellations. Men worked by lantern, some without gloves, hands bleeding on cold steel. Sleep was a luxury none could afford. They rotated in 2-hour shifts, one team thawing rails over fires, while another hammered ties into frozen ground. The sound carried faintly over the snow, the rhythm of hammers, the hiss of steam. A heartbeat returning to a body thought dead. Above them, artillery still rolled like thunder, but within 48 hours, a whistle would echo through the Ardennes again, proof that persistence could outrun destruction. War is remembered for battles, generals, and flags, but in the Ardennes, victory was measured in inches of rail and the steady thud of hammers striking frozen steel. For the men of the 701st Railway Grand Division, the front line was a set of tracks buried in snow and silence. There were no medals promised, no cheering crowds waiting, only cold, exhaustion, and the knowledge that if they failed, thousands of soldiers at the front would go hungry. Stranded in the winter woods, they were men of industry, former railroaders, steelworkers, and mechanics drawn from across America. Some had never fired a rifle in combat, but they knew how to drive spikes and rebuild bridges under pressure. They called themselves track walkers of victory. Their uniforms were dirty and patched, their faces blackened by smoke. Yet, their precision and speed matched any combat unit in Europe. In a war dominated by tanks and bombers, their tools were almost humble. Hammers, acetylene torches, timber, and raw strength. The cold turned every metal part into ice. Gloves froze to wrenches. But when engines roared back to life in the distance, they felt purpose return. The human angle of this operation reveals something rare: the fusion of civilian skill and military discipline. Many of these men had worked railroads back home in Pennsylvania, Ohio, or Missouri. They carried in their minds the rhythm of locomotives and the smell of creosote-soaked ties. When they looked at the wreckage before them, they didn't see despair. They saw a problem to be solved. A line to reopen. Captain William M. Harris, their commanding officer, divided the crew into rotating teams. One cleared wreckage, another relayed sleepers. A third assembled the bridge that would carry the line across the shattered stream. To keep morale alive, Harris told stories of home, of the tracks they'd worked before the war. Some men sang in rhythm with their hammer blows, a ghostly chorus rising through the night air. Every moment was a test of endurance. The temperature sank below 15 degrees. Coffee froze in tin cups. Boots stiffened until they cracked. Men slept standing against locomotives for warmth. Enemy artillery never ceased completely. Shells fell sporadically, scattering ballast and splinters. Yet the engineers worked on, heads low, bodies pressed into the earth when explosions drew near. This was not heroism in the cinematic sense. It was something quieter, deeper, the unglamorous courage of persistence. The tactical angle of the rebuild was no less remarkable. The railway line in question formed a crucial junction linking supply depots in Luxembourg to the forward positions near Bastogne and the Meuse River. With trucks bogged down in snow and roads under constant attack, rail remained the only reliable artery for mass logistics. Reopening it meant restoring the flow of ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel precisely when Patton's Third Army prepared to strike north. Every minute saved by the 701st rippled through the chain of command. Commanders adjusted timetables, convoys reloaded, and tank battalions began refueling for the counteroffensive. Patton himself, known for his impatience, monitored the effort closely, later writing that, without the railmen, the Third Army would have stalled before Bastogne. The environmental angle added another layer of danger. The Ardennes forest in winter was both enemy and prison. Deep drifts swallowed equipment. Timber cracked in the cold. Oil thickened in engines. Men suffered frostbite within hours. When they ran out of wood for bridge supports, the engineers cut down nearby trees, trimming trunks with axes and shaping them by eye. Improvisation became survival. Still, they refused to slow down. A field report from the 701st noted, "We worked with picks frozen to our hands. Each spike we drove felt like striking back at the winter itself." By dawn on the second day, progress was visible. The bridge frame stood tall, rails aligned, locomotives idling nearby with plumes of white steam curling into the gray morning. Infantrymen passing by cheered as the crew tightened the last bolts. One soldier wrote later in his journal, "We thought the railroad boys were mad, but by the time the sun came up, they'd done it. The trains were ready." For the Germans, the idea that Americans could rebuild under those conditions defied logic. Their doctrine assumed weeks of paralysis after sabotage. Instead, in less than 2 days, the Allied supply system breathed again. The broken artery had healed, a testament not to machines, but to men who refused to stop swinging their hammers. By the second night, the valley glowed with a strange light, a haze of steam, lantern glow, and the orange flicker of cutting torches. From the ridge above, it looked almost unreal, a field of fireflies moving in disciplined rhythm across the ruins of steel. This was no random scramble. Behind the apparent chaos lay a perfectly choreographed industrial ballet. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps had spent months perfecting a system that mirrored American industry itself. Supply depots functioned like factories, repair teams like assembly lines. When the line near St. Vith went down, every section already knew its role. From Liège came flat cars loaded with prefabricated bridge panels and new rails. From the rear areas near Luxembourg rolled generators, cranes, and welding units. Even the food arrived in timed intervals, hot soup and black coffee from field kitchens that moved with the rhythm of the work. The 701st operated as a single machine, its heartbeat measured in hammer blows per minute. At the center of it all stood Captain Harris, a man whose voice could cut through snow and smoke alike. He walked the line with a clipboard wrapped in oilcloth, checking progress, encouraging men by name. In his reports, he rarely mentioned enemy fire, only the schedule. To him, the clock was the only true adversary. But beneath that discipline, the men were changing. Days earlier, they had been anonymous laborers. Now they were participants in a battle fought not with rifles, but with willpower. They began to speak of the track as though it were alive, a wounded thing they were determined to save. Private John Reynolds, a former switchman from Chicago, later recalled, "We stopped feeling the cold after the first night. It was like the rails were part of us. We weren't just fixing them. We were keeping the whole war moving." That shared conviction bound them tighter than any chain of command. When one man's gloves froze solid, another tore a sleeve from his own jacket to wrap his hands. When a welder collapsed from exhaustion, two others carried him to the field stove, then returned to his post without a word. The teamwork extended beyond the crew itself. Nearby infantry units lent guards and shovels. Quartermaster detachments scavenged lumber from wrecked houses. Even local Belgian civilians appeared, offering wheelbarrows, tools, and strong coffee brewed over open fires. For a brief moment, amid the war's devastation, the front line became a community of survival. Psychologically, the effort rewired what these men believed about themselves. They had arrived in Europe as technicians, told that victory depended on logistics. In the Ardennes, they learned that logistics could feel like combat. Every sound in the night, a distant engine, a whistle, a falling shell, was a reminder that their work carried the weight of thousands of lives. That awareness pushed them past human limits. Sleep came in 10-minute snatches beside the rails. They learned to eat standing, to read gauges by matchlight, to ignore pain, and somewhere between exhaustion and clarity, the task became something more profound, proof that creation could triumph over destruction, even in the middle of a war built to erase. When dawn came on the second morning, the valley seemed transformed. The snow around the new bridge was trampled flat, glittering with frost and fragments of metal. Steam curled from a locomotive set to test the line. Men stood in small groups, faces gray with soot, watching as the engine eased forward. The wheels clanked across the repaired section, slowly, then faster, until its whistle pierced the air like a cry of defiance. For the first time in days, supplies began to move again. Fuel drums, ammunition, food, and medical kits, all the lifeblood of an army, rumbled across rails that had been a ruin less than 48 hours before. At that moment, the men of the 701st realized they had done more than fix a railroad. They had proven that resilience itself could be engineered, with sweat, grit, and unshakable faith in one another. The Germans would later note in their intelligence summaries that the Americans possess a curious genius for improvisation. They never knew the names of the men who rebuilt that line, but they felt the result in every stalled advance and every lost opportunity that followed. By the second night, the valley at St. Vith no longer felt like a work site. It felt like the front line of civilization itself. The storm had returned with renewed fury, and with it came the sound of artillery, the slow, heavy rhythm of German 88s probing for targets in the dark. Men worked beneath flares that burst overhead, each one turning snowflakes into falling sparks. The light exposed their silhouettes, bent figures hauling steel, hammering spikes, dragging bridge beams across the half-frozen ground. Every noise risked drawing fire, yet silence would have meant failure. The enemy's guns could destroy their work in a heartbeat, but hesitation would destroy it just as surely. Captain Harris called for the final alignment check. The replacement rails gleamed in the dim glow of lanterns, straight and true, stretching away into darkness like a promise. He tapped his watch. They had less than 4 hours before Patton's scheduled fuel convoy was due to depart from the depot near Luxembourg. If the train couldn't cross by dawn, the tanks advancing toward Bastogne would halt, and the German counterattack might regain its momentum. It was at that moment that disaster nearly undid them. A low, distant rumble rolled across the valley. Not thunder, but the telltale growl of incoming artillery. The men froze, listening. A second later, the first shell struck the embankment, showering them with mud and ballast. Two more followed, closer. The ground shuddered. Harris shouted for cover, but there was none. The crew threw themselves beneath girders and machinery as shrapnel sliced through the air. One of the newly laid sections of rail was hit, splintering a tie and twisting the metal slightly offline. For a moment, everything fell silent except for the soft hiss of escaping steam. Then Harris stood. "Check the line!" he yelled. Private Reynolds and two others ran to the impact point, flashlights flickering through smoke. The damage was real. The alignment shifted by barely an inch, but enough to derail a locomotive. Harris looked at the watch again. Time was bleeding away. They could have waited for daylight. They could have asked for reinforcement. Instead, the crew did what they had done all along. They adapted. They jacked the rail section by hand, using crowbars and the broken remains of an old timber beam for leverage. In the bitter cold, their breath fogged around their faces like smoke from small fires. Each correction took minutes that felt like hours. When the final measurement showed the track was true again, Harris gave the order. "Light the boiler." "We test it now!" The crew gathered as the locomotive, black and massive, hissed forward onto the repaired span. Steam billowed, curling around their boots. The first few feet were agony. Every groan of metal, every flex of timber sounded like failure waiting to happen. Then, halfway across, the engine's weight settled. The bridge held. The wheels clicked rhythmically. 1, 2, 3, and then rolled on, picking up speed. The whistle blew, a single long note that cut through the snow and echoed across the valley like a victory cry. Men cheered, some laughing, some weeping quietly into their scarves. The line had lived again. Reports later recorded that a supply train left Luxembourg at dawn, crossed the newly restored section by mid-morning, and delivered fuel to Patton's advance that same afternoon. Those few hundred tons of gasoline would power the tanks that smashed into the southern flank of the German offensive and relieved the siege of Bastogne. From the perspective of the High Command, it was another logistical triumph. From the men on the ground, it was something far more intimate. A victory measured not in miles gained or enemies destroyed, but in the act of rebuilding under fire. What few outside that valley knew was how close it had come to failure again that same night. At 0300 hours, a reconnaissance plane reported German armor moving toward the region. If the enemy advanced another 5 miles, the rail site would fall within direct line of fire. Harris received the warning without expression. He gathered the crew, now resting beside the steaming locomotive. "We've done our part," he said simply. "If they hit us, they'll have to hit a working railroad." No one left. They spent the remaining hours reinforcing the embankment, spreading gravel, checking the bolts again. Dawn arrived as a gray, exhausted light over the Ardennes. The storm had eased. Across the valley, the first supply train appeared, a black silhouette cutting through the mist. As it rolled over the new bridge, every man on the crew stood at attention. The engineer leaned from the cab, saluted, and opened the throttle. The wheels thundered past, flinging snow into the air, a storm of steam and triumph. In that moment, the men of the 701st had not just repaired a railway, they had proven that America's strength was not only in its weapons, but in its will to rebuild faster than war could destroy. And somewhere beyond the front, in intercepted German reports, one officer wrote with disbelief, "They rebuild what we destroy before the smoke clears." When the first supply train cleared the valley at dawn on December 23, 1944, its whistle was more than a signal. It was an announcement to the entire front that movement had returned. The sound echoed across frozen ridges and snow-choked villages, a noise so ordinary that it became extraordinary. For days, soldiers had heard only artillery and the grind of retreat. Now they heard commerce again, the pulse of an army reborn. At headquarters in Luxembourg, logistics officers updated the map. A thin red pencil line, once marked impassable, was drawn solid again. Teleprinters clattered with new timetables. Patton's staff, bent over their operations chart, smiled for the first time in days. Fuel convoys that had been idling in depots could now roll forward by rail, saving days of hauling over deadly roads. Ammunition stockpiles, nearly depleted at Bastogne, would be replenished before nightfall. Patton understood better than anyone what that meant. His entire plan, the famous 90-degree turn northward to rescue the 101st Airborne, depended on speed. A general who hesitates, he had written, is lost before the first shot. Now he had the momentum back. Trains began arriving hourly, unloading gasoline in 55-gallon drums. Each drum meant another tank moving, another artillery piece firing. The restored railway had become, in effect, the fuse for his counterstrike. The men of the 701st did not see the grand strategy unfold. They were too busy clearing snow from switches and coupling flat cars. Yet every clank of metal they heard in the distance, every train whistle sliding down the valley, told them their work mattered. Couriers rode in with messages of thanks from Patton's quartermaster and the Transportation Corps chief. One note simply read, "You turned the tide with hammers." Elsewhere, on the German side of the lines, confusion grew. Field reports from the 5th Panzer Army described Allied logistics operating with unnatural efficiency. The Wehrmacht had counted on the Ardennes weather to stall the enemy for at least a week. Instead, they found bridges rebuilt, railways humming, and depots restocked. In a frustrated message to OKW, one German colonel wrote, "The Americans repair faster than we can destroy. It is madness." That sense of futility spread through their ranks. Tank crews, short on fuel and ammunition, began abandoning vehicles in the snow. Infantry units rationed shells. Every day the railway operated, the balance tilted further. What had started as a local repair became a symbol of Allied resilience, a reminder that destruction could never outpace organization. By Christmas Eve, the line near St. Vith was running at full capacity. Freight trains, camouflaged with whitewash and canvas nets, moved under cover of night. Each run carried enough fuel to power hundreds of Shermans and half-tracks. Engineers added sidings for faster unloading. Telegraph teams restrung lines along the route. It was as if an industrial artery had regrown overnight inside a body still bleeding from battle. Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters noted the achievement in a short communiqué. The restoration of rail communications behind the southern sector has materially aided operations. Behind that bland phrasing lay the truth. Without those trains, Patton's counteroffensive might never have reached Bastogne in time. On December 26th, the relief column broke through. American armor rolled into the besieged town to find paratroopers of the 101st Airborne still holding their ground. Photographs from that day show tanks marked with chalk letters, "Fuel OK," scrawled across their hulls. The gasoline that kept them moving had crossed the repaired railway 3 days earlier. When news reached the 701st, they were already miles down the line, repairing another bridge. They paused only long enough to read a telegram from 3rd Army headquarters. "Bastogne relieved. Your track carried the lifeblood." Someone pinned it to a signal post before work resumed. Among the men, pride mixed with disbelief. They had fought no battle in the traditional sense, yet they had changed one. Some would later joke that they had defeated the German army with wrenches instead of rifles. Others stayed silent, knowing the cost. 2 men had been wounded by shrapnel, another lost to frostbite. None sought medals. Their satisfaction was the roar of passing trains. For Patton, the success reaffirmed his belief that logistics was strategy. In his diary he wrote, "Railway restored in 48 hours. Astonishing. Harris's men saved us a week, and perhaps the campaign." Eisenhower's staff echoed the sentiment. The miracle of St. Vith became a case study in field engineering for decades afterward. To the Germans, it was a psychological blow. They had gambled everything on winter paralysis. The sound of trains in the Ardennes proved that paralysis had failed. When Allied reconnaissance planes later photographed the valley, smoke from locomotives curled upward like victory banners amid the snow. Analysts marked the images with one word: operational. And to history, that restored line became something larger than rails and ties. It stood for the quiet, unheralded power of repair. The idea that rebuilding, done swiftly and without glory, could decide battles as surely as guns. The 741st Hermann 1st Railway Grand Division faded back into anonymity, but the tracks they laid remained, carrying freight long after the guns fell silent. In the end, the miracle of the 48 hours wasn't just that a railway was rebuilt. It was that, in a moment when destruction seemed unstoppable, a handful of men proved that creation could still move faster. When the smoke cleared over the Ardennes and the maps on headquarters tables stopped shifting, the world moved again, on steel rails. The 701st Railway Grand Division had finished its work and withdrawn quietly to the next task, leaving behind only a line of shining track through the snow. The rebuilt section near St. Vith became more than just a transport route. It became the spinal cord of Patton's southern advance. Through January 1945, an average of 2,000 tons of supplies per day moved across that line. Fuel, food, ammunition, medical equipment, and spare parts. Trains ran through the night, their whistles echoing over the shattered forest. The Allied logistics network, once paralyzed, roared back to life with almost industrial precision. Convoys now ran on schedules measured in minutes, not hours. Engineers installed new signaling equipment, and depot workers began unloading directly onto tank transporters waiting at sidings. Within weeks, the Third Army's momentum had transformed from desperation to domination. German commanders noted the change with growing alarm. Their initial offensive had depended on speed, striking deep before the Allies could respond. But with every passing day, that speed slipped away. American divisions no longer lacked fuel. Artillery batteries no longer paused for resupply. Ammunition trains arrived faster than orders could be written. By mid-January, the counteroffensive had turned into a retreat. German tank units withdrew eastward through terrain they had once stormed, leaving wrecks and abandoned vehicles behind. Every retreating column passed near rail lines humming with Allied movement. A constant, mocking reminder that they were fighting an enemy who could rebuild faster than they could destroy. The soldiers who had rebuilt that first section rarely saw the front lines again. Their war was measured not in miles advanced, but in bridges built and tracks maintained. Many stayed with the Transportation Corps until war's end, moving from Belgium to the Rhine, then across Germany itself as the Allied advance surged forward. They built depots in captured towns, restored marshalling yards, and reopened ports. For the 701st, recognition came quietly. There were no grand ceremonies, no headlines. Instead, commendations arrived in brown envelopes, signed by generals who knew the value of a functioning supply chain. Captain Harris received the Bronze Star, and several of his men were awarded campaign ribbons for exceptional performance under combat conditions. To most of them, the medals felt unnecessary. Their reward was survival, and the knowledge that they had kept the war's heartbeat alive. In later interviews, some of the men spoke little of glory. They remembered the cold, the fatigue, the endless sound of hammer on steel. Private Reynolds said it best years later in an oral history project. "You don't think about saving armies when you're laying track. You just keep going because you can't stand still." Their story, largely hidden in supply reports and after-action summaries, became known among logisticians as the Miracle Line. At Fort Eustis, Virginia, headquarters of the U.S. Army Transportation School, cadets still study the 701st's operation as a model of wartime improvisation. It's taught not as an engineering feat, but as a philosophy. In war, movement is life. The line at St. Vith survived to see peacetime. Long after the guns fell silent, Belgian railway workers continued to use the same bridge supports installed during those 2 frozen nights in December 1944. Freight trains once again crossed the valley, carrying coal instead of shells, timber instead of tanks. In that sense, the work of the 701st never truly ended. It simply changed its cargo, from instruments of war to materials for rebuilding Europe itself. The rails that had carried Patton's fuel in winter now carried bread, cement, and refugees returning home. By spring 1945, the snow had melted from the Ardennes valleys, uncovering twisted steel, burned tanks, and one shining ribbon of rail still perfectly straight. Locals called it la voie du miracle, the miracle track. Farmers watched Allied trains thunder past carrying food instead of shells. Children who once hid from air raids now lined the embankments to wave at the engineers. The 701st had long since moved east, yet their handiwork had become a living monument to resilience. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, Captain Harris received the telegram in a makeshift rail depot outside Frankfurt. It was brief. Victory confirmed. Resume civil lines. He didn't cheer. He simply removed his gloves, rubbed the grease from his hands, and looked at the locomotive idling nearby. The same machine that had tested the bridge at St. Vith months earlier now stood ready to haul timber for rebuilding. In that moment, he realized they had spent the war teaching destruction how to build again. For many of the men, that lesson carried into civilian life. Reynolds returned to Ohio and joined a railway company, later designing bridges for interstate highways. Others became civil engineers, factory foremen, mechanics, quiet builders who carried the discipline of those 48 hours into peacetime America. They didn't talk about heroics. They talked about systems, schedules, efficiency. The war had taught them that victory depended not only on courage, but on coordination, on men who could think under pressure, improvise with whatever lay at hand, and finish before dawn. Historians later called this the infrastructure generation. Millions of veterans who returned home and built the modern world from the same instincts that rebuilt a railway under fire. The highways that crisscrossed America in the 1950s, the logistics networks that fueled global trade, all bore the intellectual DNA of men like Harris's crew. They had learned that motion was survival, and they applied it to peace. In the military academies, the story of St. Vith became legend. At West Point and Fort Eustis, instructors drew a simple line on the board and told cadets, "This is where an army lived again." It was no longer a tale about rails and hammers. It was a lesson about time. How, in war, the side that controls time controls destiny. German officers captured after the Bulge often spoke with reluctant admiration. One post-war debrief noted, "The American strength is not merely material. It is the speed at which they repair what we destroy." That single sentence summarized the collapse of the Reich's war machine better than any battle report. Germany could innovate, could fight, could destroy, but it could not rebuild as fast as America could recover. Years later, when journalists tracked down the surviving members of the 701st, they found them scattered across the country, modest men in their 60s and 70s. Asked what they remembered most, they didn't mention medals or commanders. They remembered sound. "The hammer strikes," said one. "The hiss of the steam. The whistle when that train crossed." To them, that noise wasn't just victory. It was proof that something broken could still carry weight. By the time the Cold War began, the U.S. Army Transportation Corps had immortalized the event in its official motto, Nothing happens until something moves. The miracle at St. Vith had shown that movement itself could be a weapon. That logistics, not headlines, decided wars. Today, if you stand on the restored line through St. Vith, you can still hear the distant rhythm of trains passing. Few travelers know that beneath their wheels lie beams laid by exhausted men in the dead of winter 1944. The bridge foundations remain, reinforced by modern concrete, but the old rivets are still there, rusted, yet unbroken. Every train that crosses carries more than freight. It carries the echo of a truth forged in fire and ice. Victory belongs not only to those who fight, but to those who rebuild faster than the world can fall apart.